Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. The proposal by the group Better Together to unify St. Louis City and County is heated, but does all that heat really generate any light? Today we try to change that by talking to the man who literally wrote the book on how and why St. Louis City and County have 88 cities, 55 police forces, and a tangle of competing local governments. Terry Jones is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Public Policy Administration at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Back in 2000, Jones, who by acclamation is the dean of political scientists in these parts, wrote a book called Fragmented by Design. It traces the history and consequences of St. Louis City and County being split apart and the dozens of smaller governments that resulted from that split. More recently, he's turned his attention to Better Together's plan to unite the city and county into one large metro city. And for the most part, he doesn't particularly like what he sees. Jones has written a 4-page summary analyzing and in some cases demolishing Better Together's arguments, and it's our pleasure and honor to welcome Terry Jones to the Jaco Report. Terry, great to see you again. Thank you very much for coming in.
Good to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, in Fragmented by Design, you go over in quite a bit of details how the divorce between St. Louis City and County first occurred in 1976, and among other things, 1876. Sorry.
But who's counting?
But what's 100 years among friends? But you also go through the proposals that have come down the pike since then, and there have been a number of them, to reunite the city and the county in some way, shape, or fashion. When this first came along, when Better Together first came along, how does it strike you it fits within these proposals that have come before and yet came to nothing?
This is the most dramatic change that has ever been suggested, although it mirrors to some extent the one in the 1920s and one that was proposed in the early 1960s. What makes it most dramatic is it totally gets rid of all municipalities, although the 1921 did, and has a new unit surviving it. The one in the 1920s would have had the city of St. Louis taking over everything, and the one in the early 1960s would essentially have had St. Louis County taking over everything.
Well, given that, how does this, being an expert on this and having read all these proposals, how does this one strike you in terms of being sensible, being a viable plan, or being nonsense?
Well, it's less democratic than its predecessors.
In what ways?
First of all, in the way in which it's developed. The 1920s plan was developed by a board of freeholders with representation from both the city and the county.
Now, a board of freeholders would have been people who would have been selected with a specific purpose?
Yeah, by the mayor and the St. Louis County executive. Their meetings were in public. They're essentially a governmental body. The report is issued. There's an opportunity for input and then commentary. The 1962 was an outgrowth of an earlier late 1950s investigation and assessment to have a district-wide government, eventually taking things like MSD and others and putting them in a single pot in a district and having an overall metropolitan mayor, but keeping St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and the municipalities. So it had a lot of attention then, and the proposal that was put forth in 1962 also was very much open to public view, and everybody knew what was going on, and everybody who wanted to had an ample opportunity for input.
And the Better Together
Better Together plan, they went out to the public, but in a very general, vague way. What would you like to see? There was no opportunity for the public to comment on the plan itself and specific elements of the plan. Better Together released it on a January morning, and by mid-afternoon, it was been filed in the Secretary of State's office. So there was no opportunity for people to say, well, how about this or what about that instead? And while there have been two now additional iterations each time, it's been a very short period of time, no opportunity for the public to say, what about making this change or this alteration?
How does it strike you that the other two plans at least grew out of the public sector, that they were, the people involved in it were governmental officials, and this was created behind closed doors by people hired by a libertarian billionaire who has always said, A, the less government the better, and B, I want to slash taxes to the bare minimum?
This has been very much a top-down effort, more top-down than any of its predecessors, although they had some top-down elements as well.
Does that in and of itself make it suspect or no?
It does, because the 5 people who supposedly wrote the plan were not appointed by anybody. They were selected by an organization called Better Together, whose funders are unknown but widely presumed to be primarily one individual, Rex Sinquefield. And since they announced and rolled out the plan in late January, they've been nowhere to be seen. The town halls that Better Together has held since then have been staffed by employees of Better Together, not citizens, if you will. So there's that act. And then the way in which the plan itself reads, it has several undemocratic elements in it.
Such as?
First example, it's going to affect St. Louis City and St. Louis County very directly. It's the way in which we govern ourselves, but it's going to require a statewide vote because of the way in which they structured the plan. They could have structured it in a ways, for example, by having St. Louis County, their surviving government, that would have fit within the Board of Freeholders process and could have had then a local vote. They could have also put in the amendment as additional provision. This amendment will not become effective unless approved by a majority of the votes in the state, as also St. Louis City and St. Louis County. They avoided that. I'll give one more example. When we form a new government at the local level or at the state level, or when we change our form of government, we go through a process that typically has the citizens deciding, hey, we need to look at this, voting to have a charter commission or a constitutional convention, voting for the people who will be in that convention, delegates to it, or be on that charter commission, giving them some time to work, bringing it back to the people for a vote of the people. The charter for the model for Metro City, as it's going to be called, or would be called if it passes in 2020, will be developed by 2 individuals. Then the county executive as of January 1, 2021, and the city of St. Louis mayor as of that same date. And unless rejected by 2/3 of a metropolitan council to be elected in 2022, it'll become the charter. There will never be a public vote on the charter.
How does that strike you then, if you add all of these together, that this, rather than being citizen-driven, has been private sector-driven? Rather than being in public, it has been behind closed doors. Is that alone enough to say this is undemocratic and it should just be rejected out of hand?
Certainly it is for Terry Jones, and I think it is for a lot of others as well.
This is just a non-starter.
Well, I think the process is very dangerous to have that kind of autocratic, top-down inability of the people to develop their own government. The first 3 words of the U.S. Constitution are "we the people." The first 3 words of the Missouri Constitution are the "we the people." If you look at the St. Louis County Charter, the City of St. Louis Charter, charters for cities like University City and Clayton, you have some version of the "we the people." This will be "we" county executive, then whoever it is at that time, and mayor of City of St. Louis, Lyda Kristen.
If you talk to a lot of people in the city, they'll say this almost seems like a jihad against the city. The city's prime source of revenue, the earnings tax, or a metropolitan income tax, if you want to call it that, is eliminated, while municipalities in the county would still elect their own mayor and city council as part of the new Metro City. The city of St. Louis would just be blown off the map. It would no longer exist. They say, this seems almost like a jihad against the city of St. Louis.
Well, it's ironic. If you watch the rollout of the plan in January, the people that were proposing it, these 5 individuals, or at least 2 of them, talked about how equity and achieving racial justice was the major motivation for why they were doing what they were doing. But if you look at the plan, it makes African American influence in the governance of St. Louis City and St. Louis County less rather than more. To build on what the points that you've already made, while there'll be the form of a leadership elected for a place like the Webster Groves Municipal District, the successor to the city of Webster Groves, in St. Louis, the government disappears, elected leaders. There'll be a thing called the St. Louis Municipal Corporation. It'll have 5 directors, all appointed by the Metro City mayor.
There was an article in the Riverfront Times just yesterday or today, and has been online, by a former city official who had called the folks here at Better Together and said, okay, maybe yes, maybe no, but I'd like some more input on this. Is there any way, for example, we could work around the the statewide vote. We could do this and this and this and maybe just have the locals vote on it. And supposedly he was told by people in Better Together, no, the reason we designed this is because we know the locals are going to reject it and we're going to jam it through in outstate Missouri. If true, that's absolutely appalling.
Well, it certainly fits into the undemocratic characterization of the whole process.
So, given that this is an undemocratic process that formed this, what are the specifics in the plan besides blowing up the city of St. Louis that rub you the wrong way as a political scientist?
Once this Metro City charter is in place, if you or I want to change that charter, pieces of it are embedded in this constitutional amendment. So to change it, we would need a statewide vote again on the charter. That's one. Number two, if parts of it that do not need a statewide constitutional vote, but do need a vote of the now citizens of Metro City, it requires a 2/3 vote to do it, not up to 50% plus one vote to do it. Those are two examples.
And yet, excuse me, in Fragmented by Design, in studying this, you know, it was a very even-handed book. You didn't say, this is great, this is awful, but this is the way it is, and here's how it proceeded. You had said earlier that the fragmentation might not necessarily be the worst thing in the world in terms of a lot of services being duplicated, which is one of the main selling points of Better Together. Explain that.
What we're trying to accomplish in the metropolitan areas in terms of governance is a balance between being regional and doing things that need to be done as a collective together regionally in a very effective way, but also retaining the localism, the Jeffersonian democracy that is part and parcel of American democracy. We like governments that are responsive, that are close, or accessible. And you tried, so one of the unfortunate aspects of this debate has been turned into, by some, into a debate of, are you a regionalist, which must mean you're a visionary and looking to the future, or are you one of those parochial localists? The secret, or the challenge, really, in St. Louis is to balance those two. We've done a better job than we give ourselves credit for. We've actually done a lot of things regionally in the last 50 years, starting with MSD and going all the way up to Great Rivers Greenway.
Is there any compelling reason to adopt a plan like this, even if it's not the Better Together plan, even if you came out with a series of public meetings run by boards of freeholders and there was a lot of public input? In your mind, having studied this, is there any compelling reason for anyone to propose and go for this sort of unigov where you'd create a city of over 1 million people?
Well, this is actually much more dramatic or drastic than unigov. Unigov retained the municipalities in Marion County. Didn't get rid of them in Indiana. Okay, didn't get rid of them. Didn't even merge the police departments until about 40 years after it started. To use either Louisville, Jefferson County in Kentucky, or Indianapolis, Marion County in Indiana as an examples, that's very different from what's being proposed by Better Together.
So is there any reason, is there any compelling reason from an economic point of view, from a social equity point of view, from a delivery of services point of view, to do something like this?
Political scientists and others have studied other city-county consolidations. What they've found on the three arguments that are often used on their behalf, well, it will save money. None of them have saved any money of any significant size, at the best 1%. It'll make us more economically competitive. The record is very mixed. Some areas that have done the city-county consolidation have experienced some growth, and some that have not. Just as some metropolitan areas that are highly fragmented have done quite well, and others that are highly fragmented have not done so well, which suggests it doesn't have to do with what kind of governmental form you have. It has to do with other factors like educational attainment, number of foreign-born and welcomingness to foreign-born, amount of venture capital, and so forth.
Where do you think then, if it's not because of the fragmentation we are being told by Better Together is the cause of a lot of our civic woes and economic lagging behind a lot of other, go-go markets, what is it then that has led St. Louis to keep slipping? Is it leadership? Is it lack of educated population? Is it the wrong kind of industries? I mean, where is it if it's not fragmented government?
It's all of the above of the list you just gave. But on the top of my list would be race. Our racial divisions and separation keep us from achieving so much. So not only is it a just thing to do to be have racial equity, it's also a pretty smart thing to do in terms of improving the economic and other parts of quality of life in the region.
Yeah, I think back to Atlanta when they didn't unify the government. They just came out with a slogan that they lived up to, which is a city too busy to hate. We're too busy making money and moving ahead to worry about racial divisions. One would have thought that, the cradle of Gone with the Wind in the old Confederacy would have been a really tough nut to crack, and now it's become a world-class city without a governmental reorganization. So I assume then it's just a matter of the civic mindset where governmental and civic and popular leaders say, okay, here's the way it's going to be.
It is, and it's unfortunate. Indeed, here we are again. We're going to use a lot of our civic capital, a lot of our deliberative oxygen on an issue that will not make that much of a difference, if any. At the same time, we should be dealing with race in a much more vigorous manner. Not that we're not doing anything, we just need to do more. Educational attainment, although programs like St. Louis graduates are making significant progress. Attracting more foreign-born population, although the Mosaic Project is a very good step in that direction.
Where do you see this going? I mean, just, never, always make sure that the anecdote isn't the singular of data. But anecdotally, it seems to me that this thing, if it was put to a vote, would go down in a heaping ball of flame in both the city and the county, that I think a majority of people in both jurisdictions are against it.
Certainly, those that at the time that the rollout said, well, look at it carefully, the devil's in the details. It's been the case that the more details people become aware of, the less they like them.
The more devilish it becomes. You mentioned race, and this is something that fascinates me. A lot of the objections to this plan have been racially based from black city politicians. They mentioned the same thing you did, that African American political representation would be shrunk. And then you've got a lot of white people in the county who, when they think city of St. Louis, they think black, and that's why we moved out here, to get away from black people. I find it interesting that our greatest sin and our greatest impediment also becomes a prime talking point while we're wasting time talking about this.
Indeed. It's one thing that we keep wanting to avoid the issue. It's a hard issue. We dug a very big hole over our history in terms of racial division. It's going to take a lot of energy to get out of that hole. And sometimes it's very tempting to say, well, we'll put that aside. Let's do something with tinkering, and maybe that'll be a silver bullet. It isn't.
Let's switch from being a political scientist to a political tactician for a moment. If you've got a reclusive libertarian billionaire and his minions, a man who has money to burn and has burned it on all sorts of unsuccessful political campaigns around this state, and has a lot of politicos, state and local, in his pocket to push this thing through, what tactically would be the best way to defeat it?
To defeat it with that individual?
Just make sure it goes away, whether it never comes to a vote or when it's time for a vote that it's rejected.
First of all is to reinforce that it should have a vote within the city and the county in addition to or separate from the statewide vote. And as you know, there are resolutions in the General Assembly to that effect that were debated as recently as yesterday.
Do you think the state has any business voting on what the St. Louis metropolitan area is going to look like?
It has very little business doing that. We should be able to govern ourselves in the city and the county, just as we should not tell the city of Kansas City or Springfield or others how they should govern themselves.
And a final question, Terry. You talked about sucking up oxygen. When I first moved here in 1995 and in the late 90s, there was this thing called the Pierce Report, which was going to be, this study to end all studies of St. Louis and the way forward. There was St. Louis 2004, which was supposed to be a similar effort. I mean, this town and its region have been studied more than, a dinosaur fossil by archaeologists. It's been taken apart and put back together a dozen times. This is another one. Expound on the idea that we're wasting valuable time with this and valuable oxygen when we could be looking ahead with something actually vital. We're just doing something else that may not come to anything.
Well, first of all, in defense of Neil Pierce, who's a friend of mine, the Pierce report pointed to the universities, and the universities getting more involved in the community as being the single most important short-term initiative that could be taken, and that happened. All of us, and particularly Washington University, UMSL, and St. Louis University, took that to heart, and we're doing much more in the community now than we did then, and I think to the benefit of the community. The 2004, which was a very big spectacle, did result in Great Rivers Greenway, so that now we're working our way steadily but to having one of the best parks and trail systems. So those were not home runs, but they were singles. We need more singles. Trying to hit a home run is very, very difficult. Singles we're pretty good at.
So more bottom-up development, more small steps.
One small step at a time.
Play small ball, don't go for the fences. Terry Jones, a pleasure as always. Great to see you again. Thank you very much for coming in. Our thanks to political scientist and author Terry Jones, and our thanks to you for being here with us. We hope to see you right back here next week for another edition of the Jaco Report.